Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on sociology of India, in today's lecture we are going to discuss on the nature of agrarian social change. Now we know that there has been a large scale economic, social and political change taking place in every part of the world. Now why is it important to understand agrarian social change? It is important because this will also help us to understand how the social relations in rural society underwent the change, and it helps us to understand the nature of rural society in India today. So to begin with, we know that agrarian change means change in the system of relationship. So we know the agrarian structure implies a relationship between different social group, the landowners, the cultivators and tenant. Now when we talk about change, the change will also be understood in terms of the not only the way in which agricultural activities are being conducted, but also the change in the relationship between the landowners, the tenant, sharecropper and wage labor. So this system includes technological and environmental factors and relationship as well as social and cultural one. Three approaches have been used to understand the nature of agrarian change. Number one, system approach. This approach will look into the system, the environment, the technology, the demography, and all these factors will bring about a change in the interrelationship within the rural society. The second is decision-making model. Now, the decision-making approach will look into the ways in which decision has been taken by people in the government, policy makers, and how these relation has affected the allocation of resources within the agricultural setup. So where in terms of say the land reform or redistribution of land was a decision which affected the relationship between the different actors in the agricultural setup. So in this decision making model, individuals are seen as making choice about their values and action and thus changing their own societies. The approach is good at explicating the success or failure of individual within the system, but the system itself is left out of analysis. The third is structural historical approach, a very common approach used in the sociology and anthropology. The structural historical approach starts with examination of production itself. It's concerned with the interrelationship of people and natural environment with the interrelationship of people in the process of production. The natural environment is also seen as the creation of the interaction of people and physical environment over historical time. The structural historical approach places ownership and control of resource at the center of analysis. Now let us look into the change that happened place in the agrarian social structure during the British period, because large scale change started taking place because of the policies of the British, and the second we will look into post independent period. So the first, when we look into the during the British period, we are aware that a number of changes were introduced in the agrarian society, and this was done by the British in order to make the governance easy, profitable and manageable. So what were the noteworthy or significant changes and the consequences? The first, which is kind of much of us are aware, is the change in the land tenure or revenue system. Some of the new revenue system was introduced during the British rule. The first was the permanent settlement system. Under this measure, the intermediary jamindar, the tax collecting officials in earlier regimes, were granted ownership right over land from which they previously only had the right to collect revenue. The second land revenue system was the Ryotwari system. Under this, the actual land tillers were given formal property rights over land. They were known as Ryot. They were the tenants of the state responsible for paying revenue directly to the state treasury and could not be evicted as long as he paid his revenue. The third was the Mahalwari or Malgujari system. Under this system, the village was identified as a unit of assessment. Through an individual cultivator in a village was made owner of the land, the villagers were asked to pay the revenue collectively. A member of the dominant family of the village was generally given the responsibility of collecting the revenue. So, the land revenue reforms which was introduced by the British rule brought about a large scale change. It led to intensive and systematic exploitation and forced the peasant to become increasingly involved with the market, because they were kind of making agriculture as kind of as much profitable and ensured that they got the larger surplus. So there was a level of exploitation. The agricultural cultivators and the wage laborers were made to work beyond the capacity in order to produce extra surplus. These measures brought about major change in the agrarian social structure. The most significant ones are, number one is the commercialization of agriculture. So we see a shift in the agrarian from a subsistence family based activity to something which was more for production of surplus value. So the emphasis was on growing more of cash crop so that it could yield a larger profit. The second consequence of the land revenue was commodification of land. Due to colonial policies, land began to acquire the feature of a commodity. A lot of value was attached to land. Why? Because it was through land that the capitalist or the landowners could earn a higher surplus value. The money lender, who until then lent keeping a peasant's crop in mind, began to see land as a mortgageable asset that you could mortgage, and therefore you can kind of ensure a larger value attached to the land. The third was deindustrialization of the economy. The influx of cheap goods from England after the Industrial Revolution hastened the process of deindustrialization by ruining the village artisan, that was also resulted in massive pressure on cultivable land. So there was the whole idea of the poverty of the Indian economy, which is kind of part of history in terms of looking into the consequences of the political economic policies by the Britishers. The fourth change or consequence was land alienation. So in the past, the professional moneylenders did not evict the peasant from his land. So they could be part of the land, cultivate on the land, and gave the the moneylenders and their share. But now, because it kind of got commercialized, land becomes a commodity, the peasants and the cultivators were evicted from the land, and therefore they became landless. Tenancy and landlessness increased, and they were kind of leading to poverty and inequality. The colonial rule brought about peripheral capitalism in India, which generated a disarticulated form of generalized commodity production, because the surplus agricultural produce was reinvested not in the local economy but in the metropolitan area. Now we look into the second historical point for the change in agrarian structure. The second is the post-independent period. Why post-independent period? Because we'll see a large number of policies, programs which has been introduced by the government to ensure that the agriculture or sector kind of improves. It had become stagnant, the lot of issues and problems, so the focus was on improving. So post-independent period, we see that it kind of renders a new phase in the history of agrarian structure. The main objective of the state or the Indian state was to transform stagnant and backward economy to make sure that the benefits of transformation and growth were not monopolized by particular section of the society. So because inequality was already kind of growing huge, so the idea was to ensure that there was some amount of equitable distribution. Some of the changes introduced in post-independent India were: number one, land reform. Land reform policies were initiated by the state to abolish intermediary tenures, regulate rent and tenancy right, confer ownership rights on tenants, impose ceiling on holding, distribute the surplus land among the rural people, and facilitate consolidation of holding. So this land reform policies, though there's a lot of negative critique that it kind of actually could not be implemented in its spirit, because there were a lot of loopholes which were kind of benefited, and it did not actually lead to egalitarian distribution of land. The second initiative was the Community Development Program. The government introduced the Community Development Program to encourage the cultivators to increase the productivity of land. The programs were designed to use modern methods of cultivation in the countryside. And what were the changes due to the Community Development Program? They were able to bring about a significant change in the agrarian economy, at least in some parts of the country. It was not kind of universally applicable, but yes, some parts kind of Punjab, parts of UP, there was improvement in the agricultural production. But apart from increasing the productivity of the land, these changes have transformed the social framework of the Indian agriculture. Agriculture in most parts of India is now carried out for commercial line. So it has kind of led the market into it. Old structure of Jajmani system, that is the system of interdependency between the patron and the client in terms of doing labor as an exchange of goods and services, kind of gets disintegrated, and it has led to more formalized arrangement, or rather it has led to the systematic strengthening of class differentiation in the agrarian society. The third change that we see in the post-independent India, which has both the merits and demerits, is the Green Revolution. Green Revolution is an agricultural development project that included high-yielding variety seeds and other fertility-enhancing inputs. And these were in terms of using chemical fertilizers, controlled irrigation facilities and pesticides. Now these were being done in order to increase production over a small land and a small period of time, so that the maximum profit could be gained from agricultural activity. The component of the Green Revolution consisted of providing cheap institutional price incentives, marketing and research facilities to farmers. The Green Revolution did lead to substantial increase in production. However, this was only limited to certain areas, and the benefit of this was not to be found equally spread in all sections of agrarian society. Let us look at the benefits of Green Revolution. So we need to actually ask the question, did the benefits trickle down to agricultural labor? Because within agricultural social structure, because of industrialization, commercialization, class strata has been generated, and there were certain who were part of agrarian social structure, yet economically, socially and politically well off. And then there was the other extreme, who were the waged labor or the landless labor. So when we look into or evaluate the benefits, we need to understand that did the benefit stay only at the top strata, or did the benefit trickle down to the landless labor? And the answer is no, it did not. It was kind of only able to be fruitful or successful for rich capitalists who were able to invest in the agricultural and gain out of that investment. So the Green Revolution made the countryside prosperous in general, because there were certain section of the agricultural society who were doing extremely well. However, what is important to keep in mind is that it further exaggerated economic inequalities in rural society. The wage of agricultural labor further gone up, but due to increase in price, their purchasing power has gone down. So the Green Revolution helped in making the agricultural labor free from relations of patronage and institutionalized dependency, but it was kind of again dependent on their economics standing in the society. So the pitfall of the Green Revolution is that it benefited only a small class of big farmers and cultivators who were able to establish dominance over the larger class of agricultural labor. The changes out of it led to increase in real wage in agriculture through lower food price. The principal beneficiaries of the Green Revolutions were those who were the best positioned to take advantage of the new technology, take advantage of the expensive chemical fertilizers and high yielding seeds, and were able to kind of spend a huge amount on the irrigation facility. So if you were limited in terms of putting your resources into place, your gain would be limited. So it actually led to increase in class differentiation and led to exploitative social relations in agrarian society. Now, when we look into the changes that has taken place in the agrarian social structure in the post-independent period, one of an important idea that we read when we kind of look into the agrarian social structure is the question, agrarian question. Now, what is agrarian question? For rural sociologists or those who are interested in studying the rural society, the effect of economic concentration in agricultural food system are analyzed through the proverb agrarian question. It basically asks certain questions. Number one, what is the relationship between the structure of agriculture and the quality of life for producers and rural community? So the whole idea is that the changes which were introduced in the agrarian social structure were with the idea to improve the social relations, to improve the conditions in agrarian society. Now, the question that arises is that did capitalism, did the increase in economic expenditure on agriculture improve the conditions of all classes in the agrarian rural structure? And the answer is no. So, in 1899, Karl Kautsky posed the question in response to his concern about the increasing scale and corporatization of agriculture in Europe. The agrarian question provides a broader framework encompassing the economic, political, and social process to understand the nature of agrarian crisis. Now, when we understand the agrarian question, we need to understand that this agrarian question is centered around the changes in rural economy, and these changes were considered as necessary for the overall development of not only rural society but the overall development of capitalism and its ultimate dominance in a particular national social formation. So when we try to understand agrarian's question, what we need to look into it, what were the nature or kind of changes that were introduced, and with these changes bring about any conducive change. So the core of the agrarian question is often expressed as the three problematics of accumulation, production, and politics. Now let us understand these three components. The first is accumulation. Accumulation refers to the surplus accumulation within agriculture and its role in capitalist development. So the idea of capitalism is based on accumulation. Only when you were able to accumulate will you be able to invest and gain surplus. So if we look into the pre-capitalist agrarian social structure, there was no idea of accumulation. Whatever was produced was consumed. Once this idea of accumulation comes in, then what happens is that some of the social agent or individual within the agrarian social structure are able to benefit from accumulation and are in a capacity to exploit the others. So that's very significant. The second is production. Now, production refers to the ways through which capitalism restructures and transforms agriculture. So, production in a kind of commonsensical sense means that you are going to produce a product or any kind of crop, and that production was dependent on the availability of land, on the ecological condition, on the irrigation facility. Now, when it kind of comes into looking into production within the capitalist regime, then it is dependent on how you restructure all of this, the ownership of land, the availability of the facility. And if you are in a position, or if you are kind of a capitalist oriented, then you are able to invest more in terms of into the production process, and the production process becomes significant over consumption and distribution. The third component is politics. Now, politics is about political forces, about state, about power, the capacity to kind of control or the decision of other. And politics in agrarian system implies the capacity to regulate the accumulation and production. So, the way in which the state intervenes in terms of ensuring that there is less accumulation and the production process is kind of then distributed on a certain guidelines and rule. So, when we look into all the three, that is accumulation, production and politics, we are able to understand the nature of the agrarian question in the reference to the agrarian social structure. Now, when we look into the agrarian question, we know that there has been a transition from say subsistence consumption to a society where agricultural has got commercialized, rather agricultural has now become an industry. So, the nature or the employment relation is similar to any other industries just as it is in the agriculture. Now, this transition needs to be occurred in all three spheres. It has happened in accumulation, it has happened in production process and in politics. So, if we look into the first, the accumulation process was that the idea was to kind of just whatever produce as enough as was required for subsistence. So, there was no accumulation. Production was without technology, without any kind of idea of producing a certain target. So, it was just dependent on nature as much as the nature could enable the production of a particular product. With capitalism, the production targets were set up, and in order to meet the target, there was change in the kind of resources that were utilized. And politics, it was earlier kind of considered as home based. Agriculture was for their own livelihood. So, there was an absence of any state regulation or state interference in it. Now, when we need to understand the agrarian transition or the agrarian question that has taken place, we need to have a holistic understanding in terms of examining the interconnection between accumulation, production and politics, and that will enable us to have a complete picture of the agrarian question. Now, when we look into the agrarian question, we have a solution of where we have landed up, and look into whether there is a kind of a transition or there is a crisis. We see that the capitalist agrarian transition has been viewed as a process of commodification of land. So, land has become a commodity, agriculture has become an industry, and the labor has become kind of landless, and they are at a extreme strata. So, through the disposition of smallholders from the land. Now, when we understand transition and crisis, there are two processes that become significant. One is primitive accumulation, that is by disposition. So, you dispose of others in order to ensure that you are able to accumulate more. So, if it's a consumption, production is taking place, only the owners of land would get the idea of accumulating, and very minimum is given to the cultivators. Second is peasant differentiation. Now, when we look into primitive accumulation and peasant differentiation, we understand that both the process has changed the nature of agrarian social structure in a drastic way, and therefore, there are many ideas in terms of understanding that is the agrarian social structure in crisis, and this needs an in-depth sociological exploration to understand the nature of agrarian crisis in India. With this, I come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you.